one question of the panelists. I just want to ask a couple of questions before we open it up. And that is, we have seen the data which are fairly strong in many ways with qualifications about the salubrious, the positive benefits of religion. Less data-oriented, but just in your own thought process, why do you think we have seen the popularity, on the other hand, recently, of a new atheist movement, of people, strong, highly educated individuals like Richard Dawkins and the recently deceased Christopher Hitchens, who have come out very strongly talking about the negatives associated with religion and how religion is delusional, how we would be better off without it. I just want to make sure we have that out there briefly before we go into the other data. Maybe, Bob, you have something, because that's been one of the signal things we've been seeing recently relating to religion is people who say religion is bad.
Actually, in America, and that's the only place I've studied, the number of Americans who say that religion is bad is really tiny, really tiny. And there's been a little bit of a growth in atheism in America, but it's still really small. What has grown in America over the last 20 years, a lot, is the people who say they are not affiliated with any religious organization or they don't have religious identity. And that's grown a ton, actually, and it's concentrated among younger people. So that's, in the jargon of sociology, those are called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S, the people who have no religion. And the growth of the nuns in America is actually astonishing. It was flat for a very, very long time. It was a constant. It was a little-known constant. It was called Putnam's constant. 5 to 7% of Americans, when they were asked did they have a religious identity, said they did. This may have been a little lower than that in the 50s, but certainly from the 60s on, it's been about 5%. But that figure now among Americans in their 20s is 35%. And if you look at the graph, it's a hockey stick. There's been a huge increase, not in atheism, and not in saying that religion is evil, but in distancing themselves from organized religion. And everything I've said now would be agreed by everybody who's looked at the data. I want to have a yellow light here because what I'm about to say now may sound like I'm suddenly descending into politics, and I apologize for that, but this is what the data to us show, and other people who've looked at the data. That increase in alienation from organized religion among young people is entirely concentrated among people at the center and left of the political spectrum, those young people who came of age during the rise of the religious right, for them, being religious means being Republican and being homophobic. I'm not saying whether that's right or not, I'm just saying that's the way they see it, because when they were coming of age, religion was associated with the religious right, and basically they've said, well, if that's what religion means, I'm out of here. It's not a theological statement. It's a statement about the intertwining of religion and politics in the last 20 years.
Do you think that's what Dawkins and Hitchens are?
No, I think Dawkins and Hitchens is a completely different discourse. I think that's a discourse that, frankly, only intellectuals, to be honest with you, are listening to. I'm talking about what millions of ordinary Americans, and most of these young nuns say they believe in God. Many of the young nuns, actually a substantial fraction of them, pray frequently. Many of them go to church. The distinction is they don't identify with any organized religion, because organized religion in their period, and this is a very different frame. Sometimes people say, well, you know, the new atheism, which is Dawkins et al., is up, which it is, and then the rise of the young nuns is up, and people think those are the same things, but they're actually quite different things. The rise of the young nuns, which is the big mass phenomenon, is linked really quite a lot to this political allergy. The larger picture is that mostly in American history, religion has not been associated with one particular party or another. Mostly, God has not been in America either a Republican or a Democrat. We're just living through a quite unusual period in American history when being religious has been associated with a particular political party. That so-called God gap is very new. Even in the 60s, people who went to church more often were more likely to be Democratic, a little bit more likely to be Democratic. So we've lived through a period in which religion and politics has come quite close together. And to return to the well-being stuff here, I think we think, and here there may be disagreements among us, and it would be useful to surface, as we've already said. We think that the real power of religion rests in the community of the faithful, not in faith itself. It's faith communities, not faith per se, that has these really powerful effects.
But what you've raised is an interesting point. We've had the connection between religion and politics, which agreed in all the days, very evident. We've had vocal people, the new atheist movement over here. What we've been missing probably is what we're talking about in this room. We've not had highly vocal people over here saying, look at the positive benefits of religion, particularly the social aspects of it. So I think that's one reason we're having this session. There's a missing component here. We don't have anybody highly vocal on the one side when we've had people on the other. And then because of this intertwining of religion and politics, which is extremely evident in all the data. In fact, I often say if you stop somebody going down the street and want to ask one question, know what their politics are, and they're white, because African Americans are an unusual circumstance, say how often you go to church. And if the person says, even, I go every week, you're a Republican.
Actually, in our data, even better is, do you say grace? And America is divided into two nations, the grace-sayers and the non-grace-sayers. Roughly half of us nationwide say grace and half of us don't. Most of us don't know people on the other side of that divide, and that answer, your answer to that question predicts a ton about how you vote and how you feel about.
Yeah, just on this, were you going to say something?
I think, let me start again. We've been talking about the benefits that religion brings to people who are religious compared with people who are not. Whenever you consider people belonging to something, there's the issue of what happens to the people who belong versus the people who don't belong within it. But there's also the relationship between the groups. And we haven't really talked about that very much. And that figures very highly in these sort of atheistical accounts. And they almost completely ignore the sort of stuff we've been talking about here. They seem completely innocent of the literature we've been talking about today, which is that religious people do better in lots of dimensions. But I mean, I think maybe I can almost quote a past conversation I've had with Bob, that there's no doubt that organized religion has accounted for an enormous amount of mayhem around the world historically. I mean, and so the churches and organized religion has an enormous amount of explaining to do, if you like, in terms of the harm it's done to other religions, from intercommunal violence in India between Muslim and on. And in our day-to-day, in this country now, the sort of homophobic, gay-bashing parts of religion in some parts of the US. So we don't want to throw that stuff away. That's there, and it's an important part of what's going on. And it doesn't gainsay what we've been saying today either, which is that within these religions, these provide help to people. Let me say a little bit too. I mean, I think the dominant view, and this is partly, I think, why there's been a reaction on both sides. The dominant view among sort of liberals, of which most academics are, and has been for a long time, was sort of what John Stuart Mill said, and what Marx and Freud said even more so, which is that as the world got to be a richer, better place, religion would wither and die, and that it was a superstition that would eventually vanish from the face of the earth as the earth became better organized. And that sort of secularization hypothesis, that as the world got to be a richer, better organized, more civilized place, there would be less role for religion, was believed very widely for a very, very long time, the best part of 100 years probably. It turns out you could see it in the data I showed you around the world. I mean, you could see why people would still think that in the poorer, least organized, if you like, least civilized, the places where the state does not have a monopoly of violence, for instance, churches are very powerful. They fill in for that. But it's not true that religion has been dying around the world. And it's not just in the United States. For instance, the wave of democratization that has taken over much of the third world, including Africa, has been accompanied by a flowering of religion again, because people care about religion. It's important for them. And when the dictators went away and they got a chance to have a more democratic life, they, in many cases, voted along religious lines. The religion came out again, was more important to them. You can see that again in some of the former Soviet Union, Eastern European countries. I mean, that it was suppressed for a long time, and it's not suppressed to the same extent now. So I think a lot of people have backed away from the secularization thing and are starting to ask much more nuanced questions about situations in which religion is thriving, in which religion is dying. You know, why are these countries so radically different, even when they're at similar levels of development? Some people would say large parts of the United States were never properly civilized. And that's why religion is so strong in some of those countries. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, if you look at the Northeast was like an offshoot of Europe. But, you know, you got democracy in the South and the West long before there was a monopoly of violence by the state, for instance, and the church filled that roles. And these things take a long, long time to die away if they ever do. So I think and I think the atheist upsurge has been in part a response to people who are very non-religious and they want to, you know, combat this interest, and people on the other side, and then there's people, I'm not very religious, I'm not anti-religious, I'm just sort of interested in this, and I think a lot of us think it's a serious topic of conversation.
Sure. Thank you, that's good, thank you. One other point, and we'll open it up. One of the things, as we all know in the data we have seen, is the rise of unbranded religion in America, which is non-denominational churches. People are religious but don't have an organizational basis in traditional denomination. You know, Episcopals, Presbyterians, Methodists, they're staying stable or shrinking. If we do see growth, it's non-denominational. Rick Warren's Saddleback Church, things along these lines, because I think people are saying, with this dichotomy, we may not like how it's organized, but we're not going to abandon the bad things that come from organized religion. We're going to go around it and form our own groups in some ways. But with that said, we're going to continue to talk, but I want to open it up, and I think we'll get some spark discussion from questions from the audience. So let's, are we going to use a mic, Quincy? All right, questions from the audience or comments? You had raised your hand first. You want to use the mic here, if you could, please? No, you have to, yeah, there, yeah.
If the PowerPoint is to be available online?
Yes, well, I think we will make the PowerPoint available. Very good question, thank you. Pretty safe question there in terms of controversy.
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, unequivocally. Yeah. Other questions or comments? And as you're getting ready to ask your question, one thing that I'm very interested in is outcomes, and that is knowing what we know and knowing that I think there is at least some agreement that increased well-being and health around the world would be a good thing. That's an admirable social goal. Is there some operational way we can talk about trying to take what we've learned here and say, all right, this might actually help the world be healthier? Bill Gates is spending billions because his goal is to make the world healthier, but it's all through secular medicine and vaccines and what have you. Many other people, well-meaning people and organizations, have their goal to help the well-being and health of people around the world. Yeah, we're talking here about the potential that there is a relationship between religion and these variables. It's very controversial. Very much disagreement, but I think that's something that I would like to discuss, and there is some connection or something that we learn from this that would make sense going forward. With that said, yes, sir.
Yes, since we have an increase in the nuns, my concern is we talk a lot about our religion, but what are you finding in the literature about spirituality, the separation between the religion and spirituality?
Good question.
I know,
the question was the difference in religion and spirituality.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
It depends a little bit. If you ask about the word spirituality or spiritual, most Americans use the term spiritual, most ordinary Americans, it turns out, use the word spiritual as a synonym of religion. We ask people in our survey, essentially, how religious are you on a 5 or 6 or 7 point scale? And then we ask them how spiritual they were. And essentially, those were exactly the same response. It's as if we had asked exactly the same question. I know that there's some discussion among sociologists about the category of spiritual but not religious. And if by that you could be using that term, that's actually not the way the ordinary American would use it, because the ordinary American uses spiritual to mean religious. But there is a category of people that I described as the nuns who, for them, they think of organized religion as being, frankly, very highly politicized, and that's not them. But in other respects, they look a lot like ordinary religious people. That is to say, they were raised as religion, they pray, they believe in God. They just don't want to go to church because for them, given when they were raised, going to church meant, essentially, it felt to them like it meant enrolling in one particular political party.
I imagine that for the nons, spirituality means moving away from doctrine and ritual and more into the experience. And we've asked different types of questions in faith communities. We ask about spiritual commitment, and there are questions like, does your faith give you inner peace? Do you speak words of kindness to those in need? Are you a person who's spiritually committed? Questions like that. They get more at that element. In the analysis we did on our panel, we found pretty similar effects between that and religiosity. Again, it might be to what you're speaking to, Bob, that if you ask people in general, they may equate them the same, but if you're ever able to separate out those nons, you may see a difference in terms of how they interpret those.
Let me ask one question of Chaeyoon, and then we'll go on. Would you advocate that Americans should immediately get more friends in a religious setting in order to increase health and well-being? Michelle Obama, the First Lady, is strongly working at increasing Americans' health right now, right? We have a strong commitment in general towards higher mental health, which in turn may lower health care costs, which is a huge and increasing part of the budget. You have the solution in your hands, right? If you can just start a campaign and say, get more friends in a religious setting, all of these social indicators will go up, our health care costs will go down, and we'll all be happy ever after. Yes or no?
Tough question. Since I began to study this and after this finding, that's the question I've been asking myself. I've never been to church in my entire life. My mom tried really hard. She's a devout Catholic. Somehow she failed to socialize me as a Catholic and never been to church. If I really believe in my research, shouldn't I begin to go to church? Still not going to church. I think it's just tough. I don't think first of all, I think my excuse is that there are many different sources of life satisfaction, happiness, and well-being. True that it is a very strong predictor of subject to well-being. But I think, you don't make decision to go to church purely because, okay, people who go to church are more happy. I want to be happy. Maybe I can go. Maybe I have to begin to go to church. Yeah, I've been thinking about that, but somehow I just cannot bring myself.
Well, there are many ways to increase physical fitness, and at Gallup, if we produce evidence that we went to a health club or gym 8 times in the month, we get a discount on our health insurance. Therefore, Gallup should say if we get from our priest or rabbi a signed seat that we've been there, then same idea. Now, there are many ways to increase happiness, but we know this is one, so I think there is a possible logical conclusion. I'm throwing this out as a provocative hypothesis.
Yeah, well, I don't think we should be encouraging people to go to church. I mean, I think what we should be doing is publishing these results and let people, we should be emphasizing these results. I mean, people don't know this. And if you read the atheistical literature, you would have no idea that people who go to church do better than people who don't go to church. So, and I think people can choose for themselves perfectly well whether to go to church or not. But these results need a lot more publicity than they've got. That's right. And I think that's a very important thing. I don't think we should be designing incentives or having the government try to get people to go to church or stuff like that. But I mean, I think this knowledge is important.
Bob?
I think actually, I suppose just what you'd say, a researcher would say, that we actually need a lot more research to find out why religious friends seem to be supercharged. What is it about religious social networks that seem to have an even more powerful effect? I mean, in my earlier life, I wrote a book about the importance of having connections in general. That book was called Bowling Alone, and I was trying to argue that bowling leagues made life better for everybody. You lived longer, your community was wiser, and so on. In bowling leagues were the kind of the key answer, and it turns out it's actually not just bowling leagues, church bowling leagues. That's the really crucial element. But so the question is, what's so special about church groups? And I mean that as a serious question. I was talking not long ago with people at number 10 Downing Street about this question. They said, we're not going to get more people to go to church. So what is it that's special? It's like saying, well, eating vegetables is good for you. Okay, great. Is a potato a vegetable? Is that good for you? We need to figure out what it is about. What's the vitamins in vegetables that we could try to isolate, and then you could carry that over to a broader question about improving life satisfaction or health or whatever in America. Is it, for example, that you have life's deepest, most emotional moments are associated with church? Life, death, marriage, Is it that you share common beliefs with people in church? And what's really crucial is it doesn't matter whether it's a belief in God, maybe a belief in, you know, the importance of the environment, or a belief in some other kind of belief. Is it shared beliefs that's crucial? Is it that, as one person once said to me, well, in a bowling league you get status from bowling having the best score, but maybe in a church bowling league you get status from being nicer than anybody else. So maybe there's something about what the status competition is in groups. I don't think we know the answer to that question, exactly what is it about church groups and church friends that make them even more powerful than just any old. Any old friend is a really great thing to have, but somehow church friends seem to have a bigger oomph, and I don't think we yet know why. And until we know why, I'm not trying to get everybody else to go to church, for goodness sakes. That's not. Actually, I'm a kind of a secular guy myself, as it happens.
It's interesting from the research. Yeah, I think you had your hand. Yes, sir. Do we want to get the mic?
There's one at the very back.
Oh, we'll get to the very back after this question. And then, yes, sir.
Thank you. Just following up on that, I was kind of curious to the data that Bob and Chaeyoon were showing, especially the last graph that showed slopes of, you know, on the x-axis you had number of friends, and then on the y-axis you had, you know, whatever your score was on the happiness index. And what I found interesting about that graph, it sort of goes to, you know, what we've been talking about, is that the slopes were the same, right? So having, increasing your number of friends by X, if they're non-religious, increases your happiness, subjectively measured, however, by a certain amount, and the same appears to be true for religious friends, right? So I guess what I'm curious about is whether or not that suggests anything about what the actual mechanism is that's working here. So my thinking is that it seems like, looking at that data, if that's, you know, if that's what the story is, then it's not really about the network as much as it is about something else, like what Bob was saying about the belief system that's associated with having, you know, people in that network, right? So I mean, if you have one religious friend and you're 10 points happier than somebody who has one non-religious friend, this exact same gap exists between people who have 10 religious friends versus 10 non-religious friends, then it's not really about the size of the network, there's something else going on. So I guess I was just curious about how those parallel slopes should be interpreted.
Good question.
So the slope actually is a little bit steeper for church friend than general friend. And also, the slope for church friend is after you actually control for the number of friends you have in general. So we are looking at the people who say that they have same number of friends, but among those people, if you have more friends in church, how does that slope goes? I don't think it's fair to say that actually the slopes are about parallel. I think so. Overall, I think social connectedness again is good. I think having more close friends is good. I don't think there's any question about that, whether it's from work or whether it's from where. But you know what you're finding is that there's actually something really, you know, it's not just slope, and also the intercept itself is pretty different too. You know, whether you have two friends in. People who say that they have two friends, but none of them in church. And if you look at the people who say that they have two friends, but they are in church, and if you control for everything else, people who say that they have two friends in church are substantially happier than people who say that they have two friends outside church. So I think so we have looked at many different things. So like, you know, are church friends closer or emotionally closer? Do you see them more often? Do they share, you know, social political views more often than, you know, workplace friends? Some is very, very similar. There's not much difference actually on those kind of dimensions. Church friends are not any more likely to share political or social views than people have with their workplace friends or other, you know, friends from other places. So, you know, those are the kind of our suspicions. You know, maybe church friends, there is a strong norm among church friends that so maybe people pay more attention to what church friends think about how they behave than workplace friends. That is not necessarily the case. People actually pay more attention to what their coworkers think about how they behave than their church friends do. So we have looked at many different places, you know, what are the, you know, why church friends are different from others, but we haven't been able to find, you know, among those usual suspects, you know, maybe that's our, you know, limited, you know, we have to imagine more bigger beyond, you know, our comments, but we haven't been able to really nail, you know, how church friends are actually very different from other types of friends along those kind of dimensions. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shows there's an effect, but we don't know what the causality is.
We've been studying friends for quite a while, and one of the issues we found that's really important from a measurement standpoint is that you get at depth. And I think that might be what the church friend is getting at to some extent, because you go to the workplace, you just ask people if they have friends at work. It doesn't differentiate. It's socially desirable to say, yes, people like me, right? You ask them if they have a best friend at work, that gets to a level of depth that starts to differentiate people quite a bit. And that's not natural to have a best friend at work. Most people don't have a best friend at work. But those that do just do better in all kinds of ways. And I think churches naturally provide that opportunity. It's easier probably in a church than it is in a workplace, even though we know it's very possible in a workplace.
Do you have a control for that? Like best friend
so what you
church?
asked about is not just a friend. We asked about, we defined close friends in question, and we asked whether they have close friends in church, whether we have close friends in workplace, whether they have close friends in book club and so on. So
I get quite to the extreme, but the other thing is that friends develop in different, they don't all connect in the same ways. So we found that when you study friends, for some people it's about common interests. For other people, it's because they give them a lot of recognition. For other people, it's just fun. So figuring out those kinds of intricacies, I think, is an important part. I think workplaces can do that to some extent. Churches probably can as well. But the uniqueness of the reasons, we found, a set of common reasons why people become friends, and they don't expect everybody to perform the same role, basically.
Yeah, there was a question at the back. Yes. Yes, sir.
The divorce rate of the southern states is much higher than that of the Northeast.
Right.
And yet the religiosity is higher in the South than in the Northeast. And to what do you attribute that to? Is, for example, the Baptist idea that you can read the Bible and discover God's purpose for you, and someone reads the Bible and says, I don't have an abundant life with you anymore, babe, I'm out of here. Whereas the Catholics in the Northeast say, no, divorce is always wrong. I mean, is it denominational or what?
That you can add, it's an example of the worldwide paradox, because Mississippi, which is the most religious state in the country, and by the way, they're also the most African-American state in the country, but we looked at the data, and white Mississippians are more religious than white Mississippians anywhere else. In fact, people with no religion in Mississippi are more religious than people with no religion in anywhere else. So it's not simply a racial composition, but it's the same phenomenon you're talking about with this paradox. And these gentlemen, maybe we could speak to the issue. Why is it Vermonters who are the least religious actually are pretty positive on a lot of indicators, and Mississippi's very low on many indicators as well. It's the same paradox.
Yeah, and it's not just divorce rates, it's murder rates, for instance. Sure. I mean, there's lots of pathological outcomes are worse in places that are more religious. So my argument is that the religiosity there is itself a response to these bad pathological conditions. I mean, not in any very simple way that is happening today, but because of the way the South and the West developed in a relatively lawless place where there was lots of violence and so on, then religion was a refuge in those places. So they became very religious, and it was an effective refuge for people. So that within Mississippi, the more religious people are protected against those things relative to, and that's another reason why you don't want to over-control for things like marital status. I mean, religious people are more likely to be married, for instance. I mean, there's all of these things that are really important. But I think that's the major reason why you get this paradox, that the most religious places are often the most pathological, but the causality is in the longest term running in the other direction.
It's like in Vermont and Denmark, are you saying, Angus, people don't need to be religious because they've got positive things going on elsewhere in the social system?
Yeah, if you think of a place like Denmark or a place like Britain, the state has had a monopoly of violence for hundreds and hundreds of years, long before there were democracies and so on. And then democracy in more humane states developed over time. Those were places that the need for religion as a protection has been less strong for a very, very long time. Those things happen much later in the United States and much later in the South than in the West. It's not the only thing that's available. I mean, people talk about the culture of honor in the South too. There's different sort of immigrants came to the South and came to the North. And all of these things, I think, stimulated a need for religion as a bulwark against these behaviors that we don't like, and I think they worked. But they didn't work enough to make those states, you know, less divorces, less murders, and so on.
Yeah, right here. There's a mic.
The first, I just wanted to weigh in on the hypothesis about religion and the network of friends. So first, it's I grew up as a Catholic, and I see this also with Greek Orthodox and Jews, is that there's a well, you know, there's a deep well to draw on, and that is also a connection to others, and there's the God equation. That's not in there. So the God of oneness that connects everybody. And my theory is that it relates to that primitive fear of being rejected, right? So you're always part of the tribe. You know, you're not going to be rejected. You're not going to be cast away. So it kind of, that's kind of what I see in people that have that religious context, not even if they go regularly, but they always can connect in. And I have a question that's along a different line. So I'm hearing from the data, if I've got this correct, that there's kind of a spectrum, and you have the people that have high income, the countries that have low income. They share religiosity. And then you have, I'm thinking of people that have later stages of adult development, are proven to have more religious structure in their lives as well. And then, so I'm thinking of the alternates, right? The extremes seem to be more religious. The people that are of higher income, am I hearing that right with the data?
Income, you say?
Higher income, and but not higher income countries. So
no,
there was
at the individual level.
Individual level, the
in terms of self-reported importance of religion declines as income goes up.
But,
however, church attendance is much flatter.
Sorry, you go ahead with your question, but there are several important things to say, but go ahead with your question.
Okay.
We've interrupted you.
Well, I thought I read that there was an increase. There was one, I believe it was the presentation that you had presented, yeah. And I also thought about religiousness in prisons. So a very, I doubt that's part of your study, but that there's a lot of people that turn to religion when they are in prison.
There are no atheists in foxholes. Quite seriously, that's the saying that encapsulates that, yeah.
We've been necessarily simplifying stuff up here and talking about being religious or not religious, but there are some important differences. In particular, the question, how important is religion to your life, which is what they were talking about in their presentations, and how often you attend church, are not identical questions. And they tap somewhat different dimensions of religiosity. How important is religion in your life sort of captures I would say, psychological dimensions or faith dimensions of religion. That's correlated with, but somewhat distinct from, the question of how involved are you in a religious community as measured by going to church frequently. So in America and in many other countries, as you go up the social hierarchy, people becoming more wealthier and more educated, the faith and religion, that is the importance of religion in your daily life, that question tends to go down. But in America, at least, now, as you go up the status hierarchy, religion is more concentrated the higher up you go, or that is religion as measured by church attendance. Church attendance rises as you go up the social hierarchy, even though the psychological importance of religion goes down as you go up the hierarchy. And the correlation between church attendance and social status has changed, actually, in our lifetime, because, and this is, I guess, I think it's a kind of an important bottom line. Over the last 30 years, the white working class in America, African Americans are way more religious than anybody else, and that's true of all African Americans. But the white working class has kind of dropped out of religion in America over the last 30 years. So it did not used to be the case that religion was concentrated only among the upper status, church attendance was concentrated only among the upper status, but it has now become that way, and this is especially true among young people. Church attendance among white working class Americans has declined a lot, whereas church attendance among the upper middle class among whites has not declined nearly so much. So there is a class gap in church attendance, that is involvement in religious activities, that's different from the patterns with respect to the psychological importance, which is tapped, I think, more by the importance of religion in your daily life. That, I think, is a more psychological question. Now, you may disagree with that. That's the way it looks in our data, because we've asked both these questions, too.
Yeah, it's partly related to the fact that upper class, higher socioeconomic status are more involved in the community in general, voluntary
That's right.
activity and
Absolutely.
so forth, so there's some explanation there.
That's right.
But yeah, it's very, and also there's a practical dimension. People who are business and other reasons to be involved in the community, join the Rotary Club, join a church, has for more upper class people, has some very, very secular positives to it because it meet people. There was a question, yeah, Quincy?
I think the irony of your gathering today is that at 200 Independence Avenue, the Health and Human Service Office today is meeting for the White House Consortium on Faith-Based Organizations and Community Health.
Huh.
So HHS is looking at that. I'm always reminded that the early roots of medicine were that sense of dis-ease between man's soul and man's health, if you will. There was a sense that alienation from God actually had something to do with their disease. Now I think we're saying alienation from self has something to do with their disease. And out of that, so many churches today, when they look at their health ministry, it really is a consolation ministry. Visit the sick and bury the dead. It's not about how the church can help their well-being. Do you know what I mean? We can do much better identifying that loneliness is a leading cause of illness in this country than we can with hope. And that's the one word that I think we've left out today when we think about religion and the faith, hope, and charity, the hope, the service and charity and those things, and how they drive so much of the life purpose and meaningfulness, and how that may affect our well-being and health.
One comment there that is changing, I like to look at Saddleback Church because Rick Warren out there is really pushing this huge church. He has moved in this dimension. He has Dr. Oz shows up at his church to give seminars on how to be healthier, and he himself, as you may have read, famously recently lost, 50 or 100 pounds, again saying I need to be healthier in my religion. So I think he's glommed onto this idea that religion can actually relate to health outcomes, which is a positive. But your general point, some others can speak to it, is kind of what we're saying here. What do we know here? We all want, let me just rephrase it in terms of cost alone. Everybody in this town wants to reduce healthcare costs. We know that that's the huge kahuna out there in the budget for the years to come, and it's not going to come from minor tweakings with how much doctors are reimbursed. It's going to come from healthier people, so they don't need the system to begin with. And now we have perhaps some mechanism for that. And again, we're opening up to the possibility, is this religion some way that people would be more likely to take charge of their health and move forward? That's the question. I have no idea what HHS is doing in terms of faith-based community, faith-based organizations, but I don't think that's quite the same thing that we're talking about here. Yeah,
Can I just say one thing very quickly? I feel very uneasy about advising government about how to act on these findings, but I don't feel uneasy about telling pastors or preachers spend less time on the sermon and more time arranging for church suppers, because the church suppers are where the action is with respect to this. I don't mean, maybe in terms of the long-term, the eternal life, the certain sermons are important. I can't answer that. I don't have data on eternal life. But with respect to all the well-being and life satisfaction and stuff, it's the church. The action is in the church suppers, and the Bible study groups and so on, and not in the theology.
I think you're right. And Rick Warren's church has community groups. So if you join Saddleback Church, you're immediately put into a small group with other people.
Right.
Because he's figured that out. So in a large church, it's this interaction with the group of people that's going to be a key. And other churches have adopted the same thing.
We don't want to... sorry, I'm working with my microphone. I think some of these things are not the same in other countries. I mean, I think the role that the church plays, I mean, I'm quite convinced by the argument about friendships in the church, but I mean, the other traditional roles for churches that in many countries I think are very important are, for instance, in moderating behaviors.
Sure, that's
we
true.
saw the smoking. We
Right.
saw there's things like extramarital sex, which churches are very against. There's, you know, being married. There's prohibitions against divorce. I mean, there are lots of things that condition people's lives which don't work through friendship and do actually make people better. And also in many countries, the church is actually the primary healthcare provider. I mean, it's not just the provider that's funded by the state. I mean, in so many cases, they may be the only healthcare provider. And I wanted to take this word hope too, because I think hope is exactly what a church gives to someone who was in the situation that my father was in, who finds himself in this enormously hostile, difficult environment in which he can't resist by himself, but he can resist with the aid of the church, who can give a new meaning to his life and a new set of hope and an escape from that. And again, I'm not denying the importance of friendships, but there are other things going on there. And the meaning that religion gives and the hope that it gives and the health care and the behavioral modifications, I think, are all an important part of the story of the way that religions work around the world. And I think the balance of these things is different in different places.
All right. Yeah, yes.
Recently in Arizona, a few humanist community centers have opened. In London, there's talk of, I don't know how serious, but some sort of humanist or atheist temple or community center. Do you think those institutions that aren't religious but share the same function as far as community service, charity, and just a place for people to gather, do you think those will have the same effect on well-being as religious institutions do?
Chaeyoon, you would say no, I think.
But you know, that's what we expected when you asked about all different friendship in different types of organization, and it includes things like self-help group and so on. So we thought that we might find something similar there, but we didn't. But it's a kind of different types of organization. We don't have that specific information about this organization in our data. So I love to see whether that works, because actually, when I talked about this in my class, one of the students in my classroom actually came to me after the class, and he was really worried. And he said, you see, I'm atheist, right? So is there any way that, like, if I gather my atheist friend and, get together every Sunday and talk about our, things we care about, and are you gonna be happy as much as, those people go to church and say, like, I don't know the data. That was my answer. So, so I love to see what happens.
Yeah,
actually
we'll get another question in a second, but Jim, you had a comment?
I think from what I've seen, there's a lot of overlap between what churches do to affect well-being and what organizations could do of any type. There are certainly things that religions have to their advantage. Religious groups have to their advantage, the spirituality side of it. But I think there's an enormous amount of overlap, and I think other organizations have a lot to learn from the successful religion. In fact, I think one of the, in addition to longitudinal studies, we ought to just go out and study the heck out of really successful, high well-being religious organizations and learn from them.
Yeah, we need a Facebook religion. Well, that works. Another question. You have to be interpersonal because everybody's interpersonal. Yeah, right here, maybe time for one more.
I think there's a tendency of all researchers to try to find the one silver bullet to explain everything. And I just want to share that I just finished a study of African-American caregivers and the role of religiosity, both in terms of involvement in organized religion, personal practice as a home, and also internalized beliefs and guide for life, and looked at their physical and mental health. And it's similar to the one that was connected to all the different kinds of well-being. What showed was that those factors really enhanced the spiritual caregiving rewards of caregiving, which in turn lowered stress, which in turn made better mental health, which in turn did better physical health. We did a structural equation modeling to look at those mechanisms. So I think one of the challenges is to really unpack and look at the mechanisms for different groups of people as to how religious involvement, either personally or organizationally, really impacts health and well-being.
I think that's an excellent point, and there's probably unanimous agreement up here that there's a need for more research to try to really understand the mechanism. I think we may have time for one more question. Was there one? Yeah, right here. That'd be and then we'll have a final statement, and then we're going to have refreshments.
It just occurred to me when you were first talking, you asked the question, are people with higher well-being more inclined to be more religious or vice versa? And I think, Angus, in yours, you've talked about the other extreme, those who are in extreme need or in an extreme situation look to religion. So might you look at those that are in the middle, that perhaps are not in dire situation, but are not necessarily in a state of well-being, and look at them as it relates to religiosity? Does that tell you something other than what, do you know what I'm saying? If you look at it from the other side and say, okay, those that are not necessarily in a state of well-being, are they religious? You know, how do they fit in, as opposed to looking at those who are religious and then looking at their well-being? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Because I think not looking at the extremes, but looking at those that perhaps are just, you know, not in a great place.
And that's most of the people.
Pardon?
That's most of the people are
struggling.
Right.
You do see some of that. I mean, in the Gallup daily data, after the crash of Lehman Brothers, there was about a 2% uptick in religiosity within a day or two afterwards. And that's an example. And you get it after 9/11, you get it after, I mean, these are other data sets. But, you know, catastrophes like that. So these are people who are not in terrible straits.
Right, but they've still gone through an extreme
some event has happened. Well, Lehman Brothers crash didn't directly affect a lot of people, but it really scared people. And, you know, there was a significant uptick after that in the number of people who said they were religious.
Bob?
To some extent, we didn't, I guess, accurately describe exactly what our panel studied on, which we've talked to the same people. So one way of describing what we discovered when we talked to the same people repeatedly, for people sort of in the middle, on the, you know, not super happy, not super sad, but kind of in the middle, but had sort of the same level of religiosity at the beginning, and the same level of well-being at the beginning. If they became more religious, they started going to church more, or got another new church friend, they then became happier. And if they, on the other hand, you know, had been involved in church a little bit, but then lost a church friend, they became less happy. That's the sequence of events which makes it it's not beyond a shadow of a doubt, but makes us think that it's probably that getting more involved in a church network is causing you to feel better than that, rather than the other way around. Is that making sense?
Yes, and that would be my assumption as well, my experience. But it sounded to me like you weren't entirely sure it worked in that direction. So I wondered if you.
Well, I was trying to set this up in my opening remarks, tried to set it up as an open question so that then we could close the question after we did our data. My last word, and other people may have them too, is none of us think that we have the last word on this, because all of us have really, really good data sets. The Gallup data is a marvelous data set. Our panel is a marvelous thing. But there's a lot more work to be done, especially in trying to pin down exactly what's going on.
Excellent. Well, I want to say that this has been a remarkable session. We appreciate very much Bob and Chaeyoon and Angus and Jim for being here and sharing this, and for the very intelligent comments. We need to terminate because I know people have to go, but we do have refreshments and we're going to linger. So if there are any additional questions or discussion, we welcome interaction and talk to one another, and we'll be happy to answer questions up here. And for all of us at Gallup, and speaking for Bob as well, thank you so much for coming, and have a very, very healthy and well-being-ness day. Thank you very much.